I've been constructing a table of imagery in which, in each category, one has idealized or apocalyptic sides and demonic sides. And in these various categories, we have the paradisal trees and water one. The human, the pastoral, and so on. Then above the paradisal is the spiritual world of angelic orders. And they said that there were two kinds of such spirits. Or rather, that the imagery of both them is derived from the two levels of the upper regions of the heavens. The imagery of fire spirits is derived from the sun and the stars, and of the air spirits from the clouds and wind and birds of the lower sky. And I said that this distinction is reflected in the later distinction between the two names of angelic beings that are recorded in the Bible, the seraphim and the cherubim, which are painted red and blue, and hence you get the imagery of tongues of flame and wind and birds. Now, when you think of what the demonic parody of that would be, it would be, again, were spirits derived from the the different regions of the sky. Traditionally, the demonic spirits are spirits of heat without light who live in a kind of prison, and this symbols this imagery of hell as a place of fire, which is derived from the New Testament largely, again has the same kind of origin. And the air spirits, in their turn, are the demons of storm and tempest. Yeah.
Is Ariel then in the Tempest both sides, both demonic and
Well, Ariel and Puck in Shakespeare are derived from, not from the conception of spirits inhabiting an upper region, but from the conception of elemental spirits. And there were four kinds of elemental spirits. The fire spirits are salamanders, the air spirits are sylphs, the water spirits are undines, and the earth spirits, the gnomes, are the kobolds. And And Shakespeare he takes the old word puck and applies it to a character in the Midsummer Night's Dream who is Robin Goodfellow, the Puck. And a puck in Shakespeare's day was the kind of fire spirit that is called an ignis fatuus, that is the phosphorescent lights over marshes that people going astray in the dark would take for habitations. And Ariel, as his name indicates, is an air spirit, sylph, although in earlier magic and legend, the word Ariel, which means lion of God, is usually an earth spirit. But Puck is a mixture of fire spirit and air spirit, and Ariel is an air spirit, but they're not demons. They belong to this intermediate fairy world, which is neither demonic nor apocalyptic. And it's significant, perhaps, that these two characters in Shakespeare both act under orders from an older and more responsible person. That is, they're mischievous, but they're not evil. Yeah.
If the cherubims connected with air spirits, why in Genesis are they the ones who protect the Garden of Eden with the flaming sword?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suggest that the use of these terms was consistent in the Bible with this distinction. I'm speaking of a distinction which grew up rather later in iconography, which accounts for medieval pictures of seraphim as red and cherubim as blue, and as angels of love, fire, energy, contemplation, and angels of contemplation. But that's a later distinction. And you get the two words employed in the Bible itself indifferently for either. We don't quite know what the cherubim were. There were cherubim on Solomon's temple, and in one of the Psalms we are told that Jehovah rides around in the sky on a cherub as a kind of private airplane, and it's the cherubim, consequently, that turn up in the vision of Ezekiel. But you're quite right. Fire and air imagery could be applied to either class, and the angel of the flaming sword in the Garden of Eden story is described as a cherub. This means, of course, that evil spirits inhabit the upper air as well, and in astrological speculation, for example, you have malignant planets and malignant settings or positionings of planets and signs. And similarly, St. Paul in Ephesians I think it's 2:2, speaks of the devil as the prince of the power of the air. Now, all this demonic imagery of fire spirits and air spirits, the phosphorescent lights and the ignis fatuus and the demons of storm and tempest, now survives only in the playful symbolism of Halloween. But of course, there was a time when it was not playful at all, and and the popular imagery of witches is derived from some source more like this. Any Other question there? I've said that in pastoral imagery, you have the sheepfold, and over here, what you would have would be the beast of prey, and that these could be of various kinds. I've left out the two forms of the demonic here, the parody demonic and the manifest demonic, for the sake of simplicity. But on the sinister side, you get more particularly the dragon, and the dragon in the form of the leviathan, who is a sea serpent or a sea monster, and who is sometimes called Rahab. Up here in the human world, you have the Antichrist and whore figure, just as over here you have the Christ and bride figure, and just as the bride is called Jerusalem, so the whore is called Babylon. And by the principle of metaphor, the demonic categories are all metaphorically identical, so that the city of Babylon, the whore of Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon are to be identified with sinister animals like the dragon or the leviathan, or with these fire or storm demons. Now, the reason why they are so readily identifiable is, among other things, that up here in the divine category, all these things can be identified in Christian imagery with the body of Christ, but there cannot be a demonic divinity. That is, no demonic principle can exist as a god. He may call himself a god, he may be worshipped as a god, but he can't be a god. No demonic principle can exist as on the divine level. Consequently, these cosmological sinister creatures, these sea monsters and dragons, are identifiable with the rulers of heathen kingdoms. And they can be identified also with the gods that the heathens worship. But their root is a political root, because the actual Godhead cannot be present on the demonic side. Okay? That is, the biblical symbolism attaches to heathen kingdoms what many people today would attach to both sides. The reality is political, and the religious is the projection. The gods of Egypt are metaphorically identical with the Pharaoh of Egypt, but the Pharaoh is the reality. And, of course, in Egyptian religion, he in fact was the reality because he was an incarnate God. Now, I suggested that this world of sinister animals. As you go further out into the manifest demonic, the desert places and the ruins, which are the wasteland, you begin to approach a world where you can't say where the sinister animals stop and the evil spirits begin. If you look, for example, at Isaiah 13, at the end of the chapter, in the last 4 verses of Isaiah 13, you are told that Babylon will eventually, like Sodom and Gomorrah, become a ruin or a wasteland. And in verse 21, but wild beasts of the desert shall lie there, and their houses shall be full of doleful creatures, and owls shall dwell there, and satyrs shall dance there, and the wild beasts of the islands shall cry in their desolate houses, and dragons in their pleasant palaces, and her time is near to come, and her days shall not be prolonged. Well, the King James translators have made a valiant effort with these words, many of which don't occur elsewhere in the Old Testament, and consequently their renderings of them are sometimes a little better than guesswork. And we can't, as I say, tell where the animal stops and the evil spirit begins. The doleful creatures are the Tziyim, who are the dwellers in the Tziyah, the dry places. And in a parable of Jesus, again, the spirit passes through dry places, seeking for rest and finding none. Because the 2 dead times of the year, depending on the climate involved, are the winter or the late summer after the crops are harvested and when there's no more rain. And it's that time of year particularly it is thought of as presided over by the god of death, the waterless, the time of the waterless places. And I said last day, I don't know just how far I got with this, that in many mythologies which are older than biblical mythology, the creation takes the form of the killing of a dragon or a monster. And I quoted, I think, the creation hymn of the Babylonians, the hymn that begins with the words Enuma Elish, when from on high, and which tells how the god Marduk killed the monster of chaos, Tiamat, and split her in 2 and made heaven out of half of her and earth out of the other half. And I said that this conception of the act of creation as a dragon killing was known to the writers of the Old Testament, who used it as a poetic image, though not as a canonical story. And I pointed out various references to the leviathan, or to Rahab, in Isaiah and Ezekiel, in which these monsters are identified with the power of Egypt and Babylonia. And in the Psalms, again, one finds the story of creation as a dragon killer, dragon killing, referred to. Can you find Psalm 89? In verse 9, this is the praising of God as the controller of chaos. And I think I said that in the Gospels, the ability of Jesus to command the raging of the waves, of the storms at the sea, is a point very early made about him in the Gospel of Mark. And that repeats the original act of creation as the bringing of life and order and stability out of chaos. And here, this process is presented in the form of the killing of a dragon named Rahab. And verse 9, thou rulest the raging of the sea, when the waves thereof arise, thou stillest them. Thou hast broken Rahab in pieces as one that is slain. Thou hast scattered thine enemies with thy strong arm. And if you look back at Psalm 74, and verse 13, thou didst divide the sea by thy strength. Thou breakest the heads of the dragons in the waters. Thou breakest the heads of leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness. Now here again is the conception that we glanced at in Ezekiel 29 last day, where the dragon is identified with the river Nile, the source of the fertility of Egypt. And it is prophesied that in the last day, Jehovah will hook and land the Leviathan and throw him into the wilderness. And as the Leviathan, in the form of the Nile River, the source of Egypt's fertility, is the source of food in Egypt, it follows that the body of the Leviathan thrown into the wilderness becomes food for the ideal Israel, which is inhabiting the wilderness. And so the legend arises, which is still known in Judaism, that in the day of the Messiah, Israel will have the flesh of the Leviathan to eat. That is mentioned in one of the most powerful and eloquent Canadian novels, A.M. Klein's Second Scroll, which is a Zionist novel. And this is the scriptural source of it. Any question that far? Now, as I say, I'm not just sure how far I got last day, but had I outlined the St. George story for you? No. Well, one of the oldest stories in the world is the story of an aged and impotent king who rules over a wasteland. And that king has been around since, well, for hundreds of thousands of years before there was any writing. And he's still there in Wagner's Parsifal, and he will keep going till the end of time. And he already represents a number of metaphorical identifications. That is, he goes back to the identity of the virility of the king with the fertility of the land over which he rules. And it's because he is old and impotent that his land is a wasteland. And the wasteland is ravaged by a sea monster. And here again is another metaphorical identification. The sea monster is another symbol of sterility and waste and impotence. The sea monster demands human victims for his dinner, and, and the victims are chosen by lot. And for a while, all goes relatively well. People don't particularly mind that one of their inhabitants are disappearing every day. But when the lot falls on the king's daughter, things begin to get serious. And she nevertheless has to be tied to a rock and left there to await the monster's coming. And at that point, the youthful hero arrives from over the sea, and he kills the dragon and frees the young lady and marries her, is given her in marriage by her grateful father, and becomes the next king by marrying the king's daughter, because this story is so old that it goes back to the custom of mother right, where you inherited through the female line. You did in Egypt too, which was a great encouragement to incest, because obviously what the Pharaoh had to do to legitimize his power was marry his sister. Anyway, this is the story that's in the St. George legend and in the Perseus legend in Greek mythology. And it's easy to see the overtones of a myth of renewal of the seasons. The old king, the wasteland, and the sea monster being all images of sterility and winter and the cessation of all life. And the young hero coming from over the sea and killing the dragon and marrying the daughter being the renewing powers of the spring. And this was acted as a folk play in England. The actual choice of St. George as the patron saint of England comes from the Crusades, but the symbolism of the George and the Dragon was already very well established, and Spenser and the Fairy Queen in the first book had already identified the St. George and Dragon story with the similar patterns in the Bible. Okay? Now, if you turn from the New Testament to the story of Christ as recorded in later Christian art and legend, you notice that they make certain alterations, or rather additions, to the New Testament story. That is, the general progression of events in the Bible through which Christ goes are, first of all, that he is in heaven, then that he creates the world, because in the book of Genesis, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. In other words, the creative agent is the Word that speaks. And then there comes the incarnation, or the entry into the world of flesh. And then there is the death of Christ on the cross. Then he descends to the lower world. And then follows the harrowing of hell. I'll explain that in a moment. Then he returns to the surface of the earth in the resurrection, and after 40 days ascends back into heaven. Now, there's a considerable foreshortening of time in this sequence, an infinity between life in heaven and the creation, something like 4,000 years between the creation and the incarnation, about 30 years between his birth and his death in this world, and 3 days and 3 nights, that is, by our counting, 2 nights and 1 day, which takes you around to the resurrection, 40 days to the ascension, and then back to eternity. You notice also that of these eight stages, 2 are really not there in the New Testament. There are a few vague hints of a descent to hell, but the New Testament evidence for the descent to hell is very weak. And the harrowing of hell does not belong in the Bible at all. It was added to Christian legend by an apocryphal work called the Acts of Pilate, or the Gospel of Nicodemus, which was accepted during the Middle Ages as at least semi-canonical. And according to that, Jesus, after his death on the cross, descended into hell on the Saturday between Good Friday and Easter, and from hell he extracted all the souls that were destined to be saved, from Adam and Eve down to John the Baptist. And then comes the resurrection, which is in the Gospels, and the ascension, which is in Acts. Now, what is interesting from our present point of view about this, about these sections of the quest of Christ, is the imagery with which they are presented by painters. In in pictures of the descent of Christ to hell, hell is always presented as the open mouth of a monster, and Jesus walks down through the open mouth of this monster, which is the body of hell, and then returns with the redeemed behind him. In the interests of general decorum, he is assumed to be returning by the same route with which he entered. But, of course, other routes are possible, and one is strongly hinted at, in fact, much more than hinted at the end of Dante's Inferno. In any case, this iconography incorporates into the Christian legend the St. George and Dragon symbolism, where Jesus has the role of St. George, hell is the dragon, and the recreation of the world takes the form of redeeming mankind from the death and hell, which is metaphorically identical with the dragon. Similarly, the heroine of the story, the king's daughter who is rescued, is the bride of Christ, the Christian church. corresponding to Andromeda in the classical story. And it follows, therefore, that the aged and impotent king, who was her father, is the first Adam, that is, the beginning of human nature in its fallen and consequently impotent form. And that structure is the one that underlies, for example, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, where a figure from the Grail romances called the Fisher King, an aged and impotent king who sits by the sea fishing with the arid plain behind me, is identified with the first Adam. Okay? Now, if we start thinking mythically and metaphorically about this story, rather than logically, we notice that the principle of metaphor will take us quite a long way. The sea monster, I said that metaphorically a monster in the sea is the sea, but when the sea monster coming out of the sea is sterility and death and chaos, it follows that he must be the whole world, the whole setting or scene of that story in its state of death. In other words, if we go on thinking metaphorically, we can see that Andromeda, or the heroine, must already have been swallowed by the monster, and in order to save her, the hero would have to walk down the open throat of the monster, just as Christ is represented in doing in the Harrowing of Hell paintings. Where does this, what does that remind you of in the Bible? Yes, it reminds you of the story of Jonah. Now, if you look at the book of Jonah, you'll find that Jonah is a prophet who is told to go and prophesy to Nineveh, one of the heathen kingdoms, and tell them that if they don't mend their ways, they're for it. And it's all very well for Isaiah and Ezekiel to do this sort of thing when they're safe in Israel, but Jonah, if he's going to have to go to Nineveh, might get in trouble. He has no taste for martyrdom, and consequently he gets a ship and proceeds in the opposite direction along the Mediterranean Sea. And it's an inviolable rule of romance that if you go to sea in the Mediterranean, your ship is going to be wrecked. And so Jonah's ship, before long, is subjected to a tremendous storm. The sailors draw lots to see who's responsible, and it appears that Jonah is, so they toss him overboard. And the Lord prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah, and he is inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And then, again, 2 nights, or at least, yes, 2 nights and 1 day by our counting. And then is coughed up again onto dry land. Now, with the amount of coaching and metaphor that I trust you have had in this course, you should be able to see that the sea and the storm and the monster and the foreign country where Jonah is are all metaphorically the same thing and the same place. And what that same thing and same place is quite explicitly said in the book of Jonah itself. If you would look at the book of Jonah, in chapter 2, then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God out of the fish's belly, and said, I cried by reason of mine affliction unto the Lord, and he heard me. Out of the belly of hell cried I, and thou heardest my voice. Well, the word translated as hell here is Sheol, the grave, but where Jonah is, and where he says he is in the world of death. And so you can see the origin of these medieval pictures of Christ descending into the belly of a monster for 3 days and 3 nights following his death on the cross. It is the antitype of which the story of Jonah is the type. And Jesus in the Gospels accepts the story of Jonah as a type of his own passion, and he says that as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the fish's belly, so shall the Son of Man be.
Everybody said earlier when you were talking about Heroin being swallowed, not swallowed, you said that she must have already been swallowed, and yet I didn't understand how that got. I didn't understand the thought by which you came by that conclusion, since the story she hadn't been swallowed, literally.
Well, there is no heroine in the Jonah story, but Andromeda, yes. Well, I say that. Well, in the Greek story, of course, she's not swallowed either, but she has to be metaphorically. If you're going to carry out the metaphorical implications of the story far enough, and in Psalm 87. And the 4th verse, I will make mention of Rahab and Babylon to them that know me. Behold, Philistia and Tyre with Ethiopia, this man was born there. Now, you can see the implications of that if you remember that for most of the Old Testament period, the people of Israel were living in the middle of a heathen power. Sometimes Babylonian, sometimes Assyrian, sometimes Persian, sometimes Greek, sometimes Roman. But they were always in the middle of a heathen power which is metaphorically identical with the body of Rahab or Leviathan, just as Rahab and Leviathan are identified with Egypt and Babylon. So if you ask what corresponds to the already swallowed Andromeda, it's the bride, the people whom the hero goes down into the monster to rescue. So if you ask, where are we in relation to Leviathan, the answer clearly is that we're inside him. We've all been swallowed by him. In Old Testament imagery, the primary identification of Leviathan is with the heathen kingdoms, but all kingdoms are more or less heathen. And so, again, these monsters expand until they become essentially the world that we are all living in and want to be delivered from. Do you begin to understand now why there is so much about fishing in the Gospels, and why Jesus is so persistently associated with either a fish or with a dolphin, who also has a reputation for saving people out of water, and the salvation out of water, which comes into the story of Peter on the Lake of Galilee and so on, again has the same general overtones. The world in which we live is mythologically a subterranean world or a submarine world, depending on which element you choose. So that from one point of view, the flood of Noah has never receded. It's an old puzzle at what happened to the fish at the time of the flood. And one of the simplest and most direct answers is that we are the fish. We didn't drown, but we have had our oxygen supply severely curtailed. This world is possessed by death and corruption, which is the root meaning of hell in the Bible. I want to deal with the book of Job later, but right now there is one thing we should look at in connection with the book of Job, and that is the fact that at the end of the dialogue there's a long speech by God to Job, and this speech ends with two lyric poems in praise of the leviathan, and, according to tradition, another great hulking brute, behemoth. I say according to tradition because behemoth is the intensive Hebrew plural of the word for beast, and because of that, the translators of the New English Bible think that there is only one animal involved. But traditionally, there have always been two animals, a land animal and a sea animal. And there are two dragons, one from the land and the other from the sea, which appear in the book of Revelation. And Behemoth and Leviathan are both mentioned in the Apocrypha in the book of Esdras. And in general, the writers of the Bible are pretty clear that the demonic world is to be thought of either as subterranean or as submarine, but the one does not exclude the other. In chapter 40 of the book of Job, there is the poem on Behemoth, as traditionally rendered, and in chapter 41, he turns to Leviathan. And the fact that these monsters can be pointed out to Job means that at the end of the poem he is outside them and able to contemplate them. And the implications of that will take us quite a while to reach, but I merely wish to end with a suggestion that these two monsters have cosmological dimensions as well as political ones, in which they represent the world as the prison of time and space that encloses us. Okay. Question there?